Hello, my name is Zachary Corser. I'm a Senior Program Director and Fellow here at the Legatum Institute, and I'm very pleased to welcome both Bill Kristol, Editor of the Weekly Standard, and Yuval Levine, Editor of the National Interest. Welcome, gentlemen. They've come to the Legatum Institute to discuss conservatism, the future of conservatism and the fate of free enterprise. And we were very lucky to have them last night as part of a panel discussion, and I wanted to ask them a few questions related to that panel discussion to get an idea of where conservatism is heading and how this fits into understanding the future of free enterprise. So I will address my first question to Yuval. What are the lessons, do you think, that were learned from the 2008 crisis, judging from the response we've seen in government?
Well, I think in a way the lesson that was learned was a generic lesson that the economy had been under-regulated without giving too much thought to the nature of regulation that might have been missing or might now be needed. So that the answer has been more of the kind of regulation that existed before the crisis without thinking about whether it might have been that kind of regulation that actually helped to cause the crisis. And what I mean by that is especially the regulation of the financial sector, which encouraged for many years the growth in size of at least America's largest banks. And the response to the crisis has been an intensification of that kind of regulation and of the protection of large banks from the possibility of failure, so that in fact, rather than getting rid of too big to fail, financial regulation now makes it even more central to the way that regulators think about the largest banks, and the largest banks are now bigger, not smaller, than they were before the crisis. And so I think there's been a general sense that what was needed was more consolidation of the American economy, when to my mind what is needed is actually less of that and more regulation that enables competition rather than that protects the biggest players. So I don't think the risk is gone, and I don't think the right lessons have been learned at all.
Okay. Bill, do you have a perspective on that question?
Yeah, I don't think either political party in the U.S., at least, has come to grips with the crisis. I think one problem Mitt Romney had as the Republican presidential candidate in 2012 is that the meltdown had happened under the previous Republican president, George W. Bush. Fairly or unfairly, that's what the voters saw. And the Republican was president. Republicans had held Congress for 12 years until the end of 2006. And this whole financial system was collapsing. And what both parties, President Obama in a way had a little bit, since he wasn't in office then, could say, well, I came in, it was a mess, but gradually we're fixing it. Mitt Romney had the problem of not really being able to articulate a forward-looking conservative reform agenda that would say the way President Obama has fixed it isn't very good. It's big government, too big to fail, much too much executive discretion for regulators in the executive branch, corrosion of the rule of law. There are a lot of very deep, I think, and true criticisms that can be made of President Obama's reforms, but you can only make them or have credibility making them if you then say, but I don't want to go back to 2007 either, and here's the way I would break up the big banks or regulate the big banks or have capital requirements for the big banks. There are many ideas in magazines like the one Yuval edits and the one I edited for how to have a conservative, let's put it, a conservative regulatory structure that is pretty simple, fair, does what regulation should do, set up kind of rules for the playing field. Unfortunately, Governor Romney didn't really lay that out, and it allowed the Democrats to say, you know, it just wants to go back to the bad old days. But in a way, I think neither party has really come to grips, therefore, with what happened, and neither has much of a forward-looking solution. And we're muddling through, and the Fed's printing money, and you know, maybe the banks won't fail. Let's hope they don't for the next 2-3 years. But in terms of really getting economic growth going, really encouraging small businesses and individual entrepreneurs, really having a healthier economy, I think one problem we're having in the U.S., but maybe here in the U.K. too, is that we don't have policies in place that really are producing much economic growth.
Speaking of the UK and the US, and also thinking about the conservative response, I think all conservatives can be a bit reflexive sometimes, thinking about Reagan, thinking about Thatcher, thinking about the past. Should we continue to turn to themes that proved so successful for Reagan and Thatcher in the 80s? You know, lower taxes, deregulation, smaller government. Are these still the answers for our current problems?
I mean, I'm of two minds about this. On the one hand, it would be crazy for conservatives only 25 years ago. They were the most successful president and prime minister, respectively, of the last 75 years, at least, I would say, or since Churchill and Thatcher's case, since FDR, so certainly post-World War II. In Reagan's case, it'd be crazy to think that the world has changed so much that there's nothing to be learned from Reagan and Thatcher. So I think the basic principles in foreign and domestic policy are right. And I think the kind of political entrepreneurship they showed as individuals, taking on the establishments of their own party, but at times also going against the grassroots of their own party, incidentally, figuring out how to turn what was in effect, I think, a healthy conservative protest movement into a governing movement and with actual policies that worked. I mean, at the end of the day, that was the test, you know. There are a huge number of lessons in politics to be learned from their experiences. Having said that, the world that conservatives confront today is just different from the world Reagan and Thatcher confronted in 1978, 79, 80. The problems are not totally different, but they're fairly different. I mean, in the U.S., Reagan confronted what? Very high marginal tax rates, very high interest rates, very high inflation. That was the sort of, you know, and none of those is the case today. There are other burdens on the economy. So the opposite problem, a zero interest rate regime, not 18% interest rates as Volcker and Reagan faced in 1980, 81. So, you know, it would be kind of crazy to assume that you could just Xerox the Reagan agenda and make that the Republican or conservative economic agenda. And there's a little bit too much of that, perhaps, among conservatives. Welfare was a huge problem Reagan addressed. It was finally fixed, more or less, in 1996 by a Republican Congress of Bill Clinton. Crime was fixed to some degree by Rudy Giuliani and others in the 90s. So a lot of what just the issues are different. But now we have family breakup, we have other issues, long-term unemployment, decreasing social mobility and upward mobility. And so it does require fresh thinking, I think within basically the same framework, but fresh thinking.
Well, thinking of fresh thinking and looking ahead to 2016, what should a conservative candidate in 2016 understand about this crisis, and how should he or she communicate about this to win? Yuval, what do you think about that?
Well, I think to start where Bill left off, it seems to me that conservatives are too often in the habit of finishing sentences the way that Reagan and Thatcher did without thinking about how those sentences started, which is, we have this problem, we have these principles, therefore, and for them it was therefore low taxes, therefore low inflation. The problems are different, the principles are the same, and the challenge is, how do we apply conservative principles in economics at least, especially of free markets, to today's problems? And if the challenge is, above all, as an economic matter, that growth is too low and not broadly enough dispersed in society, the challenges we face now are very great. The challenge of how to grow the economy is very difficult. And I don't think conservatives have come to terms with the fact that the old answers are not simply the right answers, and that what you have to think about is how to get greater productivity out of the economy, how to improve the quality of the workforce, how to improve the ability of people near the bottom to rise toward the top. All enormous challenges. I think conservatives have to begin by wrestling with those questions, which, simple as it is, they simply have not done. Certainly in the United States, it's just not what they're doing now. And I think a Republican candidate that started from these challenges, that started from how do we grow and how do we help social mobility today, given today's situation, given today's society, given today's economy, would inevitably come to a new and interesting agenda. And the challenge is thinking about the right questions as much as getting to the right answers. So in that sense, it's both easier and harder than what most Republicans think they're dealing with.
Bill?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with that. And I think, and of course the country's changed. Demography has changed. The electorate that Reagan and Thatcher, so that Reagan faced, is different from the electorate that a Republican presidential nominee will face in 2016. I don't think demography is destiny or this is dooms Republicans or anything like that. There's too much demographic determinism in a lot of the discussions today. But it just is a somewhat different country. But again, I come back to the difference in situations is pretty overwhelming. You know, Cold War versus war on terror and Islamist extremism and communist and Chinese and Russian sort of authoritarianism, which is different from a Cold War type situation. At home, as I say, very different situations, weak economies in both cases, but perhaps and sluggish growth, but very different characteristics to that growth. And then just the kinds of remedies that therefore will have to be quite different. So I don't think conservatives have fully adjusted to it. There's always a tendency to want to go back to the last really winning agenda or playbook.
What's that saying? We're always fighting the last war.
Yeah, and you always want the coaches. I've seen this in politicians so many times. They always want to win. They always want to run the last election they won, even if the country has changed, or even if they're running for president now as opposed to senator or governor. Football coaches always want to call the plays that worked in the last game, but of course, things have changed and they don't always work quite as well. So there's a lot of turmoil among conservatives in the U.S. I think in the U.K. too. Different situation because here conservatives are in control of the government, but albeit a coalition. But I think a lot of the debates, a lot of conservatives watch these debates among Republicans and conservatives' primary challenges: Tea Party, establishment, immigration, big splits, and they are alarmed. You've got to pull together. The left is so well organized. The right is fighting with each other a fair amount of the time. Circular firing squad, all that. But I'd say there's some problems with that. Obviously, in the real world, you can lose elections if you get divided. But in general, especially when you're out of power, as Republicans are in the U.S., basically, you're better off having the debates. I mean, that is the one thing I would say to conservatives, and this is really why think tanks are important, why Legatum is important, why national affairs and the Weekly Standard, I think, in the U.S. are important. You've got to really argue through the issues, because otherwise you do end up with a stale agenda. The argument's sometimes a little unpleasant. It can be distracting, and it can be damaging in the short term politically, no question. Reagan's challenge to Gerald Ford in '76 did not help Ford, presumably, in his general election against Jimmy Carter. But you don't get the kind of change you need to have in a vigorous, flourishing political movement or political party without the internal debates and internal challenges and new people coming on and taking on the old guys. And sometimes the old guys are pretty good guys. But you do need that kind of turnover, just as in a business or in anything else. And I think especially in the U.S., where Republicans and conservatives are at the national level basically out of power, they should take advantage of these years to have the vigorous debates. But it's funny how people don't like it. Political consultants don't like, if you're the Speaker of the House, if you're, a Republican donor, you want everyone to be on the same page and pulling in the same direction. And it's hard to persuade people as you're going through it that this is really healthy. But look at Thatcher and Reagan, and that is a case where their example is very apt, I think. I mean, they disrupted the arrangements in their own parties and in their own side of the aisle. And there was a lot of angst and unhappiness, in 1977 and 8 and 9 about Thatcher, and certainly about Reagan taking on the Republican establishment, and a lot of really pretty bitter debates, and people who thought they had served the party well for 20 years being shoved aside by younger people. But that is what happens when you have a healthy political movement. So I think a lot of the internal conservative debates are actually a sign of health right now.
One last question, speaking about the 70s, comparing it to today. First to Yuval, do you think we're entering into a new malaise, a decade of political and economic stagnation and uncertainty, or are you optimistic about our chances of pulling out of recession or slow growth and back into one of healthy growth and optimism?
Well, a little bit of both. I'm certainly optimistic about our chances, but I do think at the moment, certainly in the United States, the leadership is not seeing the right problems and is not addressing the problems we have. So there is a danger of letting slow growth linger, which is in itself a very dangerous thing, a very problematic thing. But the answers are there. What's needed is a modernization of some of our governing institutions, of some of our political institutions, of the way our parties understand the country's problems. So I am optimistic because I think there's a lot of movement just under the surface that is pulling in the right direction. That's happening much more on the right at this point because the right is out of power, and it's just natural that people on the right would be thinking more about how to change things. But the left is going to need to move. In some ways, the left is in much greater trouble than the right. It's going to have a lot more trouble moving, and it is entering a kind of period of intellectual fatigue. I mean, we say Republicans are stuck in the 70s and 80s. Democrats in the United States have just finished the agenda laid out in the mid-1960s. They've just put in the sort of last piece of the puzzle. And of course, it's happening just as the institutions created in that period are all falling apart and proving to be unsustainable. and so they've got much more work to do. But I think that work will be done. I mean, we have a dynamic society as you have in Britain, and it's just not. They're not going to stay stuck in malaise forever. That didn't happen in the 70s either. At the worst time in the 70s, there was that movement under the surface that ended up bringing both countries out of that malaise, and I think that's happening.
Bill, last word on this?
Yeah, I think over the last century, democratic capitalism and liberal democracy have shown pretty startling resilience and under much greater threats, really, and probably more fundamental problems than they face today. I mean, there is a kind of fatalism that can sink in, though, that would be damaging and dangerous, and I think especially in some ways modern social science and some kinds of analysis, both on the left and right, leads to a certain sense that, can't control our destiny. And I think that's not true, but there's a temptation to that, and that needs to be resisted. But I do think the history of the last 100 years cuts more the other way, that especially when it looks as if one is sort of sliding into this era of malaise and sort of decline, it turns out often you get the most resilience and the most abrupt U-turns in public policy. I mean, I came to Washington in 1985 to be a very junior member of the Reagan administration, and the Berlin Wall fell 4 years later. I mean, it was so utterly unpredictable and unpredicted and a surprise and a real lesson that these things don't happen. That's like I say, a final point. I mean, history does not move sort of neatly and incrementally. You go up 10% or down 10% a year. It is much more in, step jumps or in sort of spurts and pauses. And I have a feeling that the next big changes in the U.S., maybe in the U.K. too, will come more dramatically at some point. That you sort of gradually, realize the situation is unsustainable, and then you can sometimes get big changes quite fast. And so I don't think, I think that's quite likely to happen based on history.
That we might be building towards some kind of political inflection point.
Yeah, I think so. But I do think the system, it's just unsustainable. Some of just the data. I mean, you can't run this debt forever. You can't have a zero interest rate regime forever. You can't print money. So there is, at some point, there will be a moment of reckoning. You can either go to a much bigger state and raise taxes and try to run the country that way, or you can really try to reduce government and reform these institutions that you've all mentioned that have been really unreformed in some cases for, 50 years, but even 80 years in some Social Security, and, sort of the way. So I think you could get, and I think there's more political support than people realize for those reforms if they're properly explained.
Well, gentlemen, thank you both for your very interesting comments, and I would say a successful candidate in 2016 should keep his subscriptions to the Weekly Standard National Interest current.
Well, we agree with that.
All right, thanks very much.